Hi, this is Juan Paredes, and this is my foreign policy gauntlet. So first, I want to talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. First, I want to dispel the fact that the Israel-Palestine conflict is a very complicated issue. The issue is not complicated. It's very, very simple. There is the fourth largest military in the world occupying and dominating one of the poorest regions of the world. If you look at the West Bank and Gaza Strip is completely destroyed. It's nigh uninhabitable. It's surrounded on all sides by Israel and Egypt to the south, and it's blockaded in the oceans. Gaza Strip is basically an open air prison. It has some of the highest unemployments in the world, and Israel constantly bombards them with extremely overwhelming force as a reaction to violence. Now, I don't agree with the violence that is committed from the Gaza Strip. I definitely am not condoning any of that violence. But the response Israel has as the fourth largest military in the world is completely overwhelmingly disproportionate. And if you look at the West Bank is separated into separate cantons, and they have curfews, they have checkpoints, and they're constantly under martial law. They have no freedoms over in the West Bank, and the West Bank is constantly being encroached upon by illegal settlers. This is not a complicated issue. It's a disbalance of power where Israel holds all the power, and the reason that they're able to continue to do this is because the United States protects them. The United States is the only country, the only one that protects them in the United Nations. Israel is constantly being disavowed by multiple human rights organizations. Even their own B'Tselem human rights organization within Israel is constantly disavowing their action. The Israel-Palestine conflict needs to be resolved, and it needs to be resolved humanely. The status quo cannot continue. It benefits Israel, but it's extremely detrimental to the population of Palestine. The only way forward is a single secular state in the Levant that is free to all people, whether they're Israeli, Christian, Muslim, doesn't matter. It's free to all people. It's a secular state that's democratic and that everyone has 100% freedom. Now, the question is, how do we get to that point? We can't go from the situation we're in now immediately to a single secular state that is free and democratic for everyone. It is not realistic to go from what we have now to that immediately. So if you ask yourself, how do we get there? The only viable solution from now, at this point, the only viable solution we can have to move forward to get closer to that end goal is by having a two-state settlement. A lot of people criticize the two-state settlement as impossible because the West Bank is illegally encroached upon, and you can't really, and there's over 1 million settlers in the West Bank, but 75% of the settlers can exist on 5% of land in the West Bank, and everybody else needs to leave. It's that simple. If they don't leave, then they can stay, but the occupation has to go, and so there's not going to be anything there to protect them. The only reason why the settlers can stay in that region is because of the occupation. So the settlers can keep 5% of the land. They can house 75% of the settlers within that 5%, and the West Bank can be one contiguous area, and Gaza Strip can also be connected with a high-speed rail line to the West Bank. That can have a two-state settlement that can exist now, and then from that point we can move towards a single state in the Levant. The issue is not complicated. It's very simple. It's a disproportionate balance of power, and the only reason that they're able to do that level of domination is because the United States protects them in every single international court, in the UN Security Council, in any kind of international tribunal, and in peace talks. The United States is the only nation that protects Israel for the status quo. And because of that, we are responsible to the fact of how much, in respect to how much change we can implement. All of us as citizens, we are all responsible for the situation that exists. And now next, I want to talk about the audit of the Department of Defense. Multiple times tried to audit the Department of Defense and have failed spectacularly in doing so. The reason for that is because after World War II, Truman created the national security state as we have it now. And he created a perpetual state of combat readiness where it allows the United States to not have to build up arms and perpetually be in a state of war, essentially. And this is problematic because if you create an army and you don't have a war to fight, then there's only one or two things you can do. You can either create a new war to use that army, or you can disband the unnecessary military. You can't have having a military that exists and without a war will breed a war. It's having a tool like a hammer and then looking for a nail. It's the only way to truly get the benefits of our society, to fix the dysfunctions of our social welfare programs, is to be able to fund these programs. And we are going to have a hard time funding these programs if all our public investment is going into war. To understand how much is necessary for national security and how much we need to remove for fixing the dysfunctional social welfare benefits, we have to be able to understand where the money is going and how it's being used. But the military industrial complex is so convoluted at this point that it's very difficult to understand where the money's going. Most people don't know where the money's going, and there's a lot of embezzlement in this situation. So we have to build up the institutions. We have to build up resources necessary to find out exactly where all the money's being spent, and we have to cut the military spending accordingly to only have the necessaries for national security. Beyond that, we can cut unnecessary spending and move towards increasing our social welfare benefits. With just a fraction of what we spend on the military, we can cancel student debts. We can get rid of homelessness. We can make sure that everybody has health care. There's a lot that we can do with what we spend on the military, and a lot of it is unnecessary. And we can only find out how much is unnecessary with a proper audit. So we need to do what we can to understand how much is being spent, how much is unnecessary, and then reallocate accordingly to make sure that everybody has proper lives in this country and making sure that we're not destroying lives in other countries. And now to expand more upon the actual spending of the military, we spend more money on the military than all developed nations in the world combined, and it's extremely unnecessary. The reason we spend that money is not for national security, is to maintain the United States global hegemony, to maintain its empire abroad, and at the detriment to the people at this country. All the money that's being spent in the military to make sure that we can dominate certain regions of the world is creating a scenario where people in this country are living homeless. People in this country don't have health care. People in this country don't have the necessary assistances for mental health or any kind of issues that they're facing. We don't even have the basic standards that most European countries have for social welfare benefits, for most developed nations, not just European countries. It's completely unacceptable for a country that is supposed to be the richest country on earth to not be able to have enough money to take care of its citizens because we're wasting time or we're wasting our resources making sure that we have a global empire. Thucydides said in the book, if you look at the Peloponnesian War, once you create an empire, no matter how it's created, whether it's just or unjust, once you have one, the hardest thing to do is to get rid of that empire, because it create new dangers for the empire once the influence is gone. Keeping that empire will maintain the status quo of world domination and the lack of domestic investment. We need to remove unnecessary spending from our military, only have what's necessary for national defense, and understand that national defense is very easy in the United States because we are protected by two massive oceans that very little countries in this world, no countries in this world can cross. There's no navy in this world that exists right now that can cross the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean and reach the United States. It's not possible. So you can have all the armies of Africa, China, and Europe combined, and they still can't invade the United States because they can't cross the oceans that protect us. And on this continent, we have no enemies. There's no enemies to our north or to our south. In this continent, we're completely safe, and we're protected by two massive oceans. National security is not difficult, and we do not need 11 aircraft carriers that cost over $100 billion each for national security. We need 11 aircraft carriers that cost $100 billion each for power projection and maintaining our world hegemony. We can't both maintain our hegemony and make sure people have prosperous lives in the United States at the same time. And dominating other regions, to me, is not more important than the lives that people live here. So we need to cut military spending for whatever is unnecessary for national defense. And continuing on national defense, now I want to talk about nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons eventually should be dismantled. It's not a crazy idea to do so. There's already a movement called Global Zero that is wanting to dismantle all nuclear weapons around the world and make sure that the world is nuclear free. Doing so too quickly is extremely dangerous because there's a lot of conflicts in the world that we need to resolve first diplomatically before we can move towards having a global zero nuclear weapons policy. Like, for example, the conflicts with China and Taiwan, or the conflicts with Pakistan and India, or the conflicts with North Korea. These things are dangerous, and trying to proliferate a nuclear-free world while without solving these issues first will just create more danger. But at the same time, we can't wait till the next century to be able to make our world a nuclear-free world. We just barely got away with surviving the Cold War by just luck. There was several instances that where nuclear weapons were almost set off during the Cold War. We were very close to damnation during the Cold War, and the doomsday clock is about 1 or 2 minutes away from midnight. The doomsday clock by the nuclear scientists who measure the dangers of and how close the world is to catastrophe. It's 1 or 2 minutes away from midnight. It's very close, which means that the world is very close to a nuclear or a catastrophic conclusion. And we are playing with fire. We are sitting on a throne with a sword of Damocles hanging over our head, and any minute now it's gonna snap, and civilization as we know it is gonna be destroyed. This is an existential threat as serious as climate change, and we have to be able to walk and eat at the same time. We have to be able to solve both of those issues at the same time, both climate change and the issues with nuclear proliferation. We can do both, but we have to be very careful in the timeline and how we go about removing nuclear weapons, because we don't want to create more dangers than we have now. But at the same time, like I said, we can't wait till the next century. By that point, it might even be too late. We're very close to catastrophe now. So it's very important that we move towards a global zero a no nuclear weapons world, and it's very much possible. It's not impossible to do so. Making nuclear weapons is very difficult, and the resources for nuclear weapons are very easy to monitor. So it's not an impossible thing to do, but it's going to need to take time. So now I want to talk about a war tax. So the way war is funded now, war is funded by the United States being in control of its own currency, in control of its own money supply, and if they need to fund war, they will increase the money supply if necessary. They will reallocate funds from social welfare benefits, whatever is necessary for them to fund war. They will do what's necessary, and what that does is it creates an incentive to increase the national security state that was started by Truman by increasing the budget and constantly increasing our militarization. Now, while I'm against us having complete and utter I'm against the United States removing any kind of limits in terms of increasing the budget of the military industrial complex and making it more likely for us to be involved in more armed conflicts due to our increased budget. There is a possibility of us having a war tax where they can only fund it by having the public pay for it through a tax, which will mean that the public will be directly involved in any kind of armed conflicts. Because if they can only fund war from taxing the public, then they have to have a much better argument for why that tax exists. I'm very interested in this proposal and seeing the details of exactly how this would work. But I do agree that we must rein in the spending of the military, must rein in our budget. And this is one interesting possible way of doing so. And lastly, I want to talk about the way the United States conduct wars and the way they perpetuate forever wars. After 9/11, the powers for the president to declare war have been expanded immensely to a point where they are now able to use the threat of terrorism in many instances to strike militarily at countries that didn't attack us. We can look at, for example, Libya, Syria. We can look at Afghanistan. We can look at Iraq. Iraq and Afghanistan were countries that didn't attack us. Most of the 9/11 hijackers, the suicide hijackers, were from Saudi Arabia. They weren't from Iraq, and they weren't from Afghanistan. So these are countries that the president should have gone to Congress to get a formal declaration of war to attack. For Iraq, we did. Congress did approve a declaration of war for Iraq, but they didn't do so for Afghanistan. They didn't do so for Libya. They didn't do so for Syria. We just strike at these countries, and there's other countries that we strike at constantly. We've done so in Somalia. We've done so in Sudan. The United States president does this with complete impunity and with complete discretion. This is beyond what the founding fathers wanted. The founding fathers did not want the president to have this level of discretion for committing war, because then they will do so to their benefit and it will be to the detriment of the country. We have to rein in the powers of the president, and if the president wants to commit war, they have to have a formal declaration of war through Congress. Otherwise, if they attack with complete impunity, if they attack with discretion, and they don't get a formal declaration of war, that should be an immediate impeachable offense. We should not allow the president to have this level of power, because all it does is facilitate presidents continuously going to war in situations where it's to their benefit and to the detriment of the country. Because if it's to their benefit, what harms the country isn't particularly their first priority. So as long as they can maintain power, they will continuously propagate wars where it's unnecessary. And this will only continue as long as the president has this level of power.